Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about China once again renaming places in Arunachal Pradesh as a way to stake claim to the region. We also talk about the International Olympics Committee banning Russian athletes with links to the army from taking part in the Paris Olympics. But first, we talk about the Reserve Bank of India. In the coming few days, the RBI, India's central bank, will take a decision regarding its monetary policy rate, also called the repo rate. And we will let Indian Express's Udit Misra, who we'll be talking to in this segment, explain what exactly that is.
So the repo rate is basically the interest rate at which the central bank lends money to the banking system. So just like you and I go to a bank to ask for money and they say that we'll give you these loans at this interest rate, when the banks go to the Reserve Bank charges an interest rate, and that's called the repo rate. So when you raise the repo rate, it typically means that the whole economy through the banks will find the interest rates are going up. And typically, the RBI raises repo rates whenever it wants to bring down inflation by slowing down economic activity.
The idea is that if banks charge people a high interest, then people will borrow less money and therefore they will spend less money. And the overall demand will go down. And like our school textbooks told us, when demand goes down, so does the price of things.
And, that is why this is such an important tool and the central tool that RBI has to control inflation. And it is for this reason that RBI sits every second month to decide on what should be the repo rate, depending on the conditions of the economy, the inflation rate in the economy. And that's why it's so central to monetary policy in the country.
And now, because inflation has remained high for some time, the RBI since last year has consistently been increasing the repo rate. But the thing is that repo rate as a tool is not very precise, and it actually has a lot of side effects. In fact, some say that increasing the repo rate can actually end up increasing inequality in a country. And that's what we're talking to Udit about today, about how this happens and whether there are ways to avoid it. So, Udit, when we talk about the pros of increasing the repo rate, we know that it reduces inflation, which is good for everyone, right? But what are its cons?
Right. So, I think it gets to the distributional aspect of the whole thing. When the RBI raises interest rates, it hits different people differently. If you are about to take a home loan, you are perhaps going to be far more affected than somebody who's just keeping all the money in the bank. Because a higher interest rate then pays the saver more, whereas it hits the borrower. So it depends on who is where. And for a growing economy like India, credit is a very important thing. And typically it has been argued in economies like India or say the more advanced economies like US, we've found that when the interest rates are increased and sharply so, it tends to create a certain inequality in the economy. Because often people buy assets through credit. For example, a typical asset is buying a house. And if buying a house becomes costlier, not because the house price has gone up, but because your ability to afford that credit has reduced because the credit has become costlier, that affects the ability of people to create assets, to create wealth, and that enlarges the gap between those who already have the benefits or riches and those who didn't have and were looking for cheap credit to get there.
Right, because by increasing the repo rate, you're trying to slow down growth. You're trying to get people to spend less money. And it's all right for a wealthy person to spend less money, but for a person with lesser means, it can hit them pretty hard.
Yes, because this is the importance of credit in a developing economy. You might have all the resources, but you might need timely credit to make use of those resources. You might be a great entrepreneur, you might have a great product, but you might need a certain amount of credit at the right time, or you might want that credit to buy that house, which if you were to save and wait, then it might take you a whole life. And it's only towards the end of that life that you might be able to create that asset. But credit allows you to do that. Now, by raising interest rates, you're just making that thing that much more difficult And a lot of people who are trying to catch up in the economy and bridge that gap lose out. And that is where inequality comes into picture, because inequality is nothing but the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay, so we have established that increasing the repo rate seems to increase inequality. But does that mean that reducing the repo rate decreases inequality?
So that's actually the funny thing, because while a lot of research is now coming out, which is saying that increasing interest rates is increasing inequality, what we have seen in the recent past, in the last decade or so, since the global financial crisis, is that a lot of central banks were cutting interest rates. Interest rates in the West, in particular the US central bank, made interest rates near about zero. So for the longest time, we saw economic growth happening because interest rates were at zero. And a lot of literature in countries like the US was arguing that keeping interest rates so low is increasing inequalities. And this is counterintuitive. Now, by the same logic, you would think that people will be able to afford a house. But typically what happens is that when you keep interest rates low, lot of appreciation, asset creation happens in the stock market. You spend a lot of money. All that money basically means profits of companies are improving. That reflects in the stock market. And so the argument goes that most of the asset creation or wealth creation that is happening happens in the stock market and when the interest rates are low. And who owns the stocks predominantly? It's the rich. So inequality goes up not because you are able to afford a house, but because the rich become even richer.
So basically all the money that the central banks are letting into the system by decreasing interest rates, the rich are the ones that are able to take a lot more advantage of it.
Exactly. So you think of yourself, and listeners can think of themselves and think when the interest rates are brought down quite considerably between a big industrialist in India and them and their maid, the person who benefits the most is somebody who has plans and the ability to leverage based on that low interest rate. You might be able to buy a house. Your maid might not be even getting into that situation, but the big industrialist might be launching a new company or a totally different corporate empire. And the returns as a result are skewed totally in favor of those who are already rich and capable of making use of cheap money.
Okay, so clearly in this case, we find ourselves in a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation. So what should the RBI do? Are we just doomed for failure in this case?
So there are two ways to look at this. One is that, and I've quoted last year's Nobel winner and former Fed chairman Ben Bernanke in this, where he says that, first of all, central banks are not supposed to primarily care for inequality. They're supposed to care for price stability, that the inflation does not go haywire. And they should continue doing that. And now what happens to inequality? Because there is such a muddied situation in terms of what happens to inequality, he recommends that it should be the government that should try to address the situation of inequality. So instead of monetary tools, which is about money supply, we should use fiscal tools, which are about government taxation and government expenditure. You can tax the rich more, transfer that money in some way to the poor, or use that money to create assets like a road or a bridge, which enhances the ability of the relatively poorer people to come up to a higher level of earning. The other way, within the bounds of what a central bank can do, is something that we also saw during the COVID period. We saw RBI doing it, is when the RBI can mandate, or a central bank can mandate, that I'm flooding the market with money because the economic growth is struggling. I'm saying that I'll give you a certain quantum of money, but I'm also putting a condition that 50% of this or 25% of this must go to MSMEs, smaller businesses, or it should go to people with total incomes less than this or that.
Yeah, and by doing that, you're addressing the side effects of increasing the repo rate, which is supposed to bring down the price of things, but again, as a way, affects the poor a lot more.
Exactly, because repo rate is a blunt instrument. It can raise rates for everybody and bring them down for everybody. Now, how do you deal with the side effects, as it were, or the implications of that, depending on where different people are? And different economies have different levels of inequalities. Some economies like India have massive inequalities. So we'll have to perhaps be more cognizant of the impact of what a sharp rise in repo rate or a sharp fall in repo rate does to our economy. Because with inequalities, it's not just an economic phenomena, it becomes a social unrest or a social problem.
And next, we talk about the ongoing India-China dispute. For some time now, China has been trying to claim a certain part of Arunachal Pradesh as its own territory. Back in 2017, it had released a list in which it had renamed a number of places in the state. This was repeated in 2001, and on Sunday, China did this once again. It released another list where 11 more places were renamed. To understand why China keeps doing this, my colleague Utsa Sarmin speaks to Indian Express's associate editor Shubhajit Roy.
So Shubhajit, can you first tell us why China is renaming the places in Arunachal Pradesh?
Well, you see, India and China have a contested border. So China claims some parts of India as its own. So it is, countries and the negotiators of those countries, they usually what they do is they publish maps which reflect those territories as their own. Apart from that, another standard tactic or a strategy is to name those places as per your own language so that, you develop a body of literature that supports the argument that is part of your territory. That's why you are naming that place according to your own wish. So that's exactly the reason why China has named these places in Chinese Tibetan characters.
Okay, so by doing this, what China is basically saying is that these places in Arunachal Pradesh are Chinese territories.
That's correct. And this has been happening quite regularly in the last 6-7 years, since 2017 when China started naming places. I think in the first round they named some 8 or 9 places. First time they did it in 2017. Then in 2021 they had named, I think, 6 places or something. And now they have named about 11 places, as per their wish. But obviously India doesn't accept or recognize those names. So it's one of those things that happen bilaterally by each country trying to assert its claim on the other's territory.
Right, and you mentioned that India and China have a contested border. So could you talk about how China sees it from their side?
So, as you know, China disputes the legal status of the McMahon Line, which is the boundary between Tibet and British India that was agreed at the Shimla Convention of 1914, officially the convention between Great Britain, China and Tibet. Now, China was represented at the Shimla Convention by a representative of the Republic of China, which had been declared in 1912 after the Qing dynasty was overthrown. Now, the present communist government came to power only in 1949 when the People's Republic was proclaimed. Now, the Chinese representative did not consent to the Shimla Convention, according to historians, saying Tibet had no independent authority to enter into international agreements. Now, the McMahon Line, named after Henry McMahon, who was the chief British negotiator at Shimla, was drawn from the eastern border of Bhutan to the Isurazi Pass in the China-Myanmar border. Now, China claims the territory to the south of the McMahon Line, which lies in Arunachal Pradesh. It also bases its claims on the historical ties that have existed between the monasteries in Tawang and Lhasa. Tawang is in Arunachal Pradesh and Lhasa is in Tibet. So that's how this particular, because this line has not been agreed to by, accepted by China. So therefore, there is constant contestation, and that's the history behind China claiming these territories, which are south of McMahon Line, which is part of Arunachal Pradesh, those territories as its own.
And Shubhajit, how does renaming places which are part of the Indian territory help China?
It wants those territories to be called to be their own. So in international relations, negotiations, what happens is if essentially you create a body of work, maps and other facts so that you are able to support your argument that this particular place has always been under part of your territory. So that's what China is trying to do by naming these places by itself.
Right, and could you talk about how India has responded to this move by the Chinese government?
India has been saying that, this particular Arunachal Pradesh is and will be an integral part of India. And it has said that this is not the first time China has made such an attempt. And today, the official spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs, he said that we reject this outright, and attempts to assign invented names will not alter this reality. So India has obviously rejected these claims by the Chinese government.
And Shubhajit, when it comes to the disputed border, we know that India and China are engaged in negotiations to reach an understanding. So can you tell us how these negotiations are going and whether there are any resolutions on the horizon?
So this dispute has been ongoing, and the two sides have had several rounds of negotiations. From the Indian side, they had a special representative level mechanism. Both countries have this special representative level mechanism. From the Indian side, the special representative is the National Security Advisor. Currently, NSA Ajit Doval is the SR, or the special representative as it is known as. And on the Chinese side, the special representative is the Chinese state councillor. So they've had several rounds of talks, but unfortunately, there has been no headway towards resolution of this dispute so far.
And in the end, we talk about the Paris Olympics, which are scheduled to take place next year. Last week, the International Olympic Committee took a decision that Russian athletes who have links to the Russian military would not be allowed to compete in the Games. And this means that theoretically, nearly half of all Russian athletes would not be able to participate in the Paris Olympics. In this segment, Indian Express's Mihir Vasavda joins us to talk about this, starting with why the IOC took this call.
Why is a very straightforward why, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine, since that happened a year ago, almost 99% of Russian athletes across all sports, they've been either suspended, they're not being allowed to participate, especially in European countries where they've been hit with massive sanctions, the country itself, and across the wider sports community. So until the stand here is that until Russia ends its war in Ukraine, they won't be allowed back into sport.
Right. And Mihir, was there any pressure on the IOC to take this decision?
It's funny you asked that because the IOC, after its executive board meeting last week, from the Russian side, we've been told that we are pro-Ukraine, and Ukraine tells us that you are pro-Russia. So IOC, in a way, is sandwiched. I mean, you understand the kind of situation they find themselves in. Extremely tough. It's almost a generational crisis, so to say. And since the Cold War era, that's the late 70s, early 80s, when we saw a lot of Olympic boycotts, this is the first serious threat in terms of boycotts at the Olympics, and that's the challenge IOC is facing right now.
And could you talk about the kind of influence the Russian military has on athletes? As in, have a lot of athletes historically been part of the Russian armed forces?
So before we actually go into history, I'll just get into the recent past. So last year, the Winter Olympics in Beijing, Russia won 32 medals, and out of those 32, 28 were won by athletes who belong to two clubs or two institutions. One is called the Central Sports Club of the Army, which is basically an army-run sports unit. And the other is Dynamo Society, which, as per its website, claims to work together with the security and law enforcement agencies of Russian Federation. So this is at the Beijing Olympics. Just to kind of recap, it was 28 out of the 32 medals were won by athletes from these two clubs. Then if you go back to the Tokyo Olympics, the Summer Olympics of 2020, which were held in 2021 because of the pandemic, out of the 335 athletes who represented the Russian Federation there, 109 were from the CSK, that's the Army Sports Club alone, and 50 were from the military. And Russia won 71 medals in Tokyo, and out of those, 45 were from CSKA and the rest were from Dynamo. So that kind of gives you a picture. It reflects the kind of influence the army, military and the armed forces have on Russian sport. And it's not a new phenomenon. You asked about the history. I mean, we go back to 100 years ago when Dynamo was formed. Dynamo completes its 100th anniversary this week. And it was formed with that purpose. India has borrowed a lot from Soviet era as well. And one of the things that India borrowed was this whole idea of having these tests where army uses sports as a way to judge how strong an individual is, mentally, physically, both. And then for ages, you've had army persons who have represented their country at international sports events, and then based on their achievements over there, they have been promoted within the armed forces ranks. So that's pretty much like the structure India follows too.
Right, and now if these recommendations are implemented exactly as they have been worded in the IOC document, then we know that this will impact all sports. But this decision has been debated for some time now, right? So could you talk about the kind of arguments we have heard both for and against it?
I mean, the biggest counter argument is if you ban Russia, it's a principle in theory, again, never implemented in practical life, that sports and politics do not mix. That's never happened. There hasn't been a single case where sports and politics haven't mixed. But that is the guiding principle in which people are saying that you should allow the Russians back because the athletes shouldn't suffer for what their country is doing. And then the other counter argument put here is that if you impose a ban on the Russians and the Belarusians, what happens to every other war that's happening almost on all continents, right? How do you take sides there? So that is the biggest counter argument. And those who are in favor of, imposing a ban on Russians, their argument is that since almost the entire Russian contingent is in a way linked to the armed forces, they are also indirectly supporting the war. And in some cases, you've seen Russian athletes use war symbols. Like there was this case of a gymnast who used the Z symbol on his t-shirt. In the current context means victory in Russian context. So there have been active or indirect support to the war from the Russian side. To say that all athletes are supporting the war would not be accurate right now because there is no evidence of it. But you get the argument from both sides in this case. And that's why when we said that the IOC has a very tough decision to take, it is a situation that it's never going to please both sides. Unless the war ends, one party is going to be severely aggrieved.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.